Hello and welcome to the Financial Puzzle Playbook with your host, Jim Sumpter. I'm RJ Malik, the producer of this podcast. And, for the past year, we've been talking about the 6 puzzle pieces. And I'm saying for the past year because, Jim, this episode is an anniversary for you.
It is our episode anniversary for 1 year. This is our 24th episode. And as you know, we do 2 a month.
Yep.
And so, RJ, what I thought we would do today, we've talked a lot about the puzzle pieces of a financial plan and, we have a lot of new listeners. And so what I thought this would be a great opportunity to really just kind of do a 1 year recap.
Okay.
And what I thought we would do is just kind of go through some of the episodes, talk about some of the guests, some of my favorite moments, maybe some, we won't necessarily do blooper moments, but maybe some things that we learned about ourselves. I've been a host for 1 year now, and I think I'm probably different today at 1 year than I was maybe in episode 1 or 2. And so,
yes, of course, it's just a natural progression. You are, from my standpoint, and of course I've had decades of experience in radio, from my standpoint, you started at a high level and you kept going up and up. You are very comfortable behind the mic. You're very comfortable talking with people, which is very important when you're interviewing and talking to them. You make them feel comfortable. It's very easy to talk to you, and that's a plus.
Well, and I appreciate you saying all those kind things. This is, I've been an advisor for 28 years. And this was the first time I had ever done anything in this sort of medium. And so it was new, but yet, I've never been accused of not being able to talk or not being able to carry on a conversation. My wife would tell you that I could carry on a conversation with that lamp over there if it would even remotely listen. So so this has been fun. It's been a great year. I thought we would recap, really just kind of where we started, where we've been, and then where we're headed. And I'm super excited about going forward with the podcast. So, if I look at the very beginning and I say episodes 1 and 2, and in episode 1, we really kind of got to know me. You were more interviewing me as a person, as an advisor, sort of my philosophies. I talked a lot about my dad.
Sure.
That he was my hero. And then in episode 2, we kind of talked about CMC Financial. So who is CMC Financial? And that's, that is my firm, my LLC. And CMC stands for Carson, Madison, and Cassidy. Those are my 3 kids, and I joke, I say, my kids get all my money anyway, I might as well name the company after them.
Why not?
And so we talked about that. We talked about the brand. Our colors are a little bit unique.
Yeah.
So go back and listen to that episode and learn why do we have pink in our, logo. We did talk about, and we introduced this concept of puzzle pieces, and I'll take a quick step back. The story I tell all the time is, everyone has a financial puzzle. Some people have a 50-piece, a 100-piece, a 150-piece. You might even have a 500-piece or a 1,000-piece puzzle. What we do at our firm is we help you put your financial puzzle together using cash flow, insurance, retirement planning, investments, income tax, and estate. And everything falls within one of those big, broad topics. So what we do is we help you get your puzzle together. We're looking at it at the Thanksgiving table. It's an amazing plan that we have. Everything's just absolutely like we want it. The dog comes running into the kitchen, hits the table, and a fourth of your puzzle falls off. And what that is life. That's things totally beyond your control that will affect your puzzle. And so it could be a job change. It could be a tax law change. It could be the economy wasn't as good. It could be maybe there's a medical need. Maybe something happened with mom or dad or one of your kids. Maybe you had an unexpected move. Things totally beyond your control that affect your puzzle. And so what we do is we pick those pieces up. Sometimes they go back in the same order and sometimes they don't. But that's okay because we're gonna now make modifications. And so this entire podcast is around those big, broad topics, and then we start drilling down. And so when I went to episode 3, I always say as a financial planner, everything starts with cash flow. If you don't know what's coming in and what's coming out, then it really doesn't matter about the rest of the pieces because it's not going to be put together. So we talked about that. We talked about my 50-30-20 concept. It's not something that I created. It's a general principle, but we discussed that. We discussed the difference between gross income and net income. Very important when you're talking about your financial plan. We talked about 3 stages: wealth accumulation, wealth preservation, and wealth distribution, and the way you plan in each of those. It all goes to cash flow. So then episode 4, I jumped in with Jim's 5 investment rules. These are: what is the goal for the investment? What is the risk for the investment? Are you diversified with them in the investments? You need to understand what you invest in. There's so many times that people don't exactly know what it is they invest in. So we talk about what is a mutual fund, what is a stock, what is a bond, what is a real estate investment. We talked about the concept of dollar cost averaging. And so it was, that's sort of the basics. Then episode 5, we had our first guest. The first 4 episodes was you and I having conversations.
Yes.
We had our first guest in episode 5. It was Steve Knox, who is a mortgage broker in Birmingham. He's a friend of mine. We talked about the home buying process, sort of how to navigate a mortgage. What does the pre-approval look like? When to do the pre-approval? What are closing costs? I think a lot of people, when they get ready to sign the big, thick packet of things when you have a mortgage, it's like, wait a minute, what are all these closing costs, and what does all this really mean? And so we discussed that. Episode 6, we jumped to the very end and we talked about estate, which, estate is the transfer of wealth. We do this great job of, planning all this wealth, making sure that we can do everything we want to do while we're alive. But then what happens after we pass? And so Alex Priester was our guest. She's an attorney in Birmingham, an estate planning attorney. And we discussed the basics of wills and power of attorney, medical directives. When do you need them? The different stages in life. And, so RJ, that was kind of the first 6 episodes. That was our first 3 months. So
the first quarter.
The first quarter, that's right. The first quarter of the podcast. So let me ask you, of those, how were we doing in sort of setting up this vision of what listeners could expect for hopefully years to come?
Well, I thought you set it up really nicely even before you started by, just laying out or talking about and setting up the 6 puzzle pieces.
Yeah.
Because it's easy, and I would encourage people, if you are just a recent visitor to this podcast, to go back to the first couple of podcasts. 1, to get to know Jim, and 2, to see how he's laying the foundation for this podcast. So it was interesting to watch, and it's funny how you mentioned on the 6th podcast. It's a situation that myself and my siblings are going through with my mom. She's 87 years old, and she's declining. It's an obvious situation, and we are now walking that tightrope of, making sure her finances are set. In fact, we're now to the point where myself and my one brother are really focused on her finances and making sure she's set. And then my sister takes care of her as far as health is concerned, doing the shopping. My sister lives near her, so she does all these things. And it's a difficult time, and there's really no right answer, because when the person is declining, they become a different person in a way, and that's the toughest part, because you're looking at your mom, and all of a sudden she's acting a little bit different. Her patience is not as much, and believe me, as a kid, I pushed her patience.
Yeah, you were successful in that,
and my 2
right?
brothers followed in my footsteps. So we know my mom has a lot of patience, and now all of a sudden, out of character, she loses her patience very, very quickly. And so the frustration is there. So it was good to hear you talk about that, and it allowed me to really take a step back and see how we're handling things, and even picked up some things to do. So
Well, and I will tell you, that's one of the things, because we just scratched the surface on episode 6. What we're going to do going into year 2, we have a handful of guests that we're going to talk more in depth, and I think that's what we're going to definitely, as you see this 1 year recap, and then as we move into year 2, you're going to see us go deeper within the pieces of the puzzle, within topics, and what you just described. We could probably do 3 or 4 episodes on that type of stuff, but I do have some guests lined up and ready to, kind of talk about exactly what you're talking about, from elder care, sort of the steps that it takes to get, mom or dad or whatever relative that you're working with, into that next stage in life, because it not only affects that person's stage of life, it also affects your stage of life. And, there's this phenomenon called the sandwich generation. And so what it is, the person maybe 10 or so years younger than me that has kids that they're trying to raise, and at the same time they have mom and dad that they're trying to make sure they're taken care of, and they're in this sandwich, and it's a new, it's not new because we've always sort of been there, but one thing about me, I love demographics. Okay, so we're going through this transfer of wealth as the baby boomers begin to age and begin to get older. There's going to be the largest transfer of wealth that we've ever seen in this country is going to be taking place over the next 20 years.
yes,
And as a financial planner, this is something that is talked about over and over and over at every conference I go to. It seems like every time I pick up some sort of a publication, there's something about this generational wealth transfer. And so, the estate planning area is all of the puzzle pieces are very, very important. But what you don't want to do is live your entire life and then have everything in the end not go to where you want it to go to.
yes.
And I see so many people. It's also the most procrastinated area, I would argue.
Yes,
Because
right here.
because what people say is, well, I'll get to that, or I'll get to that, or oh, okay, I'm busy now, but we'll do that next week or whatever. And so,
My wife and I just started that conversation
okay,
as
okay,
far as what we're going to do. Now, we don't have children, so that
okay.
makes it a little more, I would say, dicey.
Well, I have 3, so if you need places for your wealth to go, just let me know, and I'll get you in touch. So.
Sure. But we're looking at who's going to sort of be the person to oversee
Right.
our estate after we're gone, and then we've got nieces and nephews we'd like to take care of, and of course.
Sure.
They're not all the same, and we want to be careful with that. So
That's right.
it's an important conversation to have, but it's a difficult conversation,
Yeah.
and it's so easy, as you pointed out, so easy to put off.
It is. And so, that's, again, we scratched the very edge of the surface in episode 6.
Let's move on.
We
Come on.
moved on to episode 7,
Yeah.
and we brought in, kind of, I guess, went back to cash flow, and we started talking about real estate, because real estate, in your primary home is one of the, is generally the largest investment that we own. So I brought in a guest, Todd Tucker, who is a realtor, and we really kind of broke down the real estate contract, which, can be very lengthy, very, very long, and a lot of parts. And so we talked about, things like inspections, and then there's all these different types of inspections that you can do. And is it important to have? Is it important to not have? Things like that. Episode 8, we brought in Keith Weaver, who is a realtor, still following with the real estate theme. But here we talked about, okay, now we've moved in, we've closed on the home, but we want to do some remodeling. So what areas of the house are the best to sort of remodel to get the most bang for your buck when maybe it's not your forever home? Now, if it's your forever home, one of the things Keith pointed out, it doesn't really matter, paint the wall whatever color, whatever title you want to use, it doesn't matter. But if it's not your forever home, maybe some tips on things to do or not to do. And we talked about a couple of, one of the questions that I asked him at the end, I said, okay, what's one of the most unusual things you've ever seen? And so he sort of developed that story. So we moved on from real estate. Episode 9 was I'll be candid, it's the most watched and listened to episode that we have. Of all 23 so far. We brought in Cassidy, who is the second C in CMC Financial, and we talked about Carson's story, who is the first C.
Right.
And if you go back to episode 1, people will get my story, and so I've been married. I went through a divorce, and so I had 2 children, Carson and Cassidy. I married a person that I dated in high school, Jennifer. We reconnected 20 years later. She had Madison, and so Madison is my stepdaughter. Now, according to my checkbook, she's also my kid.
Funny how that works out.
So I view all 3 of them very, very equally.
Yeah.
But in episode 9, so Carson and Cassidy were 10 years apart. So we did one thing is we talked about how did Carson find out he was going to be a big brother after 9 years, and he was 10 when she was born. And that's a fun story. But then some not so fun stories. Carson battled cancer when he was 16 and 17, and he actually passed away 11 and a half months after his diagnosis. And so I brought in Cassidy because Cassidy was 7 when he passed away, and today she's 20. Yeah. And so really just sort of from her perspective, how did that change? Remember when I talked about the dog running in and hitting the table and your puzzle falling on the floor?
Yeah.
Let me tell you, RJ, when you hear the words your child has cancer, that is one of those, your puzzle pieces hit the floor. And I'm talking about hard, because that totally changed the perspective of our financial puzzle.
Everything.
Everything. And so, and I'm not saying it's always going to be something like that, that dramatic or like that, or even losing someone, but it's a change. And so what you have to do is I think you learn from adversity. And I think you make adjustments in your life as things happen. And so, I talk about really throughout the whole podcast, but really in that episode, about Cassidy and me and sort of some of the changes that we've made. So then we moved on. We're back to financial planning in episode 10. Mm-hmm. And, one of the biggest things that I see with people is employee benefits. And, everybody gets, if you work for a company that offers benefits, everybody at one point in time in the year, you have this open enrollment period. And so we did a part 1 in episode 10. We did a part 2 in episode 11. And what we discussed in both of those is the open enrollment process. So many people, when you're going through that, it's like, okay, here's my deadline. I got to get it done. I'm just going to choose what I did last year. And sometimes that's okay. But then other times maybe it's not. And we talked about, when would you maybe want to change? Why would you want to change? Me as a financial planner, making, if we're looking at all of your total financial plan, your employee benefits and the options that you have, that's a huge part of the plan. So episode 10, we talked about the insurance side. We talked on FSAs versus HSAs, things there, the options there, how they're different. Then we jumped to episode 12, continued with employee benefits, but we talked about the investing side. I'm going to invest in this 401k. So do I do a traditional 401k? Do I do a Roth 401k? Do I do, a model of some sort? Do I choose different investment choices? And again, what you're finding is that every decision that you make in your financial life touches a lot of these different areas or a lot of these different puzzle pieces. So everything from cash flow to, to the income tax benefits to how do you name your beneficiaries? So that's the estate benefits. To it is insurance, it is investments. So, and it does affect your retirement. So literally in those 2 episodes, I touched all 6 in various ways and in various capacities.
Sure.
We moved on to episode 12. I say a lot of times, I don't use the word guarantee. And so we shouldn't do that because I can't guarantee anything. Except that tax law will change in some capacity.
Yes, so, of course.
That is one thing that will always change is tax law, tax code. And so in episode 12, the title of it was, okay, you inherit an IRA, now what? And this is one area that things have dramatically changed. And the rules have dramatically changed over the last handful of years. We talked about the 10-year rule. If you inherit a traditional IRA, if you inherit an IRA, how old was the decedent that passed? Were they taking required distributions? Were they not? Every one of the answers to all of those questions affects really sort of the answer as to what you should do and how you should do it and so on and so forth. So, that was quarter number 2.
Right. We're at halftime.
We touched a lot in quarter number 2. What are maybe a couple of moments that you're sitting there listening, going through this, going, that was interesting. Aha, I didn't know that, or whatever.
Well, the things that you bring up, the one thing that I really like, not only about, quarter number 2, but all your podcasts, I sit here and I relate to a lot of things.
Right.
You talk about, planning and, as I sort of touched on before, my wife and I are, now looking at what we're going to do when we're gone. Now, my wife is 5 years younger than me, and I've had some health issues, so the odds are I'm going first. So, I sort of say to her, whatever you want, I'm going to be good with, because the odds are, the old joke, why do men die before their wives? Husbands die before their wives because they want to. It's a bad joke, but
well, and husbands and men just in general do dumb things. So that's the other reason.
Yes. and I'm a big I'm guilty of that, doing dumb things.
Yeah.
But so we're having that discussion, and we were talking about who we want to oversee our finances and stuff like that. And it's not an easy discussion. I thought it would be easy, but it's not an easy discussion. And but it's an important one. And that's really, when that was more, the 2-parter episode.
Right.
I really, that really stuck out to me.
Yeah.
I mean, all of your episodes are really interesting and informative, but some I relate to more than others. And 11 was something. 10 and 11 were episodes that I really found myself, paying attention and engrossed in it. And, so that's my thoughts. And I think we can move on to the third quarter.
Hi everyone, I'm Cassidy, the second C in CMC Financial. So Dad sometimes gets on a roll with this podcast and might forget to remind you about a few things. 1, don't forget to like and share this podcast and leave a review. 2, follow CMC Financial on all of the socials, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And 3, go check out the website at cmcfp.com. Okay, back to my dad. He's probably still talking.
All right, so RJ, now we move on to the third quarter, and so we get introduced to a young lady that I have mentored for probably about the last year and a half, Victoria O'Toole.
Yeah.
And, Victoria is a student at the University of Alabama. I took a risk in bringing, a student onto the podcast because it was like, okay, what can we learn from her?
Sure.
And it was fascinating to me because we learned from a college student's perspective about, investing, about saving, about budgeting, things like that. She's also a military kid. She had also moved from a different state to Alabama. So she had made a lot of big changes, and she kind of walked through some of that as she had her discussions. But I thought it was a fascinating discussion with her, so much that we actually brought her back in a later episode, which we'll talk about in a minute. But
she was very impressive for a young lady. I have to say, I was very impressed. Mature beyond her age.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, she's gonna do big things, and I'm gonna enjoy watching it.
Yeah.
I hope to one day be a guest on her podcast. So that'll be the, but we were introduced to Victoria. Okay. Episode 14 was probably, I loved every one of these. They were all my favorites. This was one where, this was our holiday episode.
Mm-hmm.
I would say if you're going to listen to episode 14, make sure you watch it on YouTube, because the attire that Jim was wearing is something that you'll probably not see very often. So I brought on my wife, Jennifer. Okay, so that was another risk of bringing your spouse onto your podcast.
And that was very interesting. I enjoyed that.
It was a holiday episode. We were talking about it, and she said, let's wear Christmas sweaters. So she's in her Christmas sweater. I'm in my Christmas sweater with a big gingerbread man. And what we talked about was really something that I hear every single year as I've worked with clients. And we talked about holiday stresses, family dynamics. This was just around the election season that we had. And, sometimes when you're sitting down at a holiday table, not everyone thinks exactly the same.
No.
And so we kind of talked through that. Have you ever heard the phrase financial stress during the holidays?
Yes.
We touched on that. And then something that was new for us this time was first-time empty nesters. We had lived for years with having children in the home, and all of a sudden we find ourselves on Christmas morning, and it's us, the dogs, and the cat.
Right.
And, so we kind of talked through that in episode 14. But again, go back, watch that one, make sure, and you can't make fun. I don't want any comments on Jim's sweater, but I thought I looked pretty good, in that one.
Sure, Jim. Yes. You looked fantastic. You looked fabulous. You looked fabulous.
Thank you. Jennifer looked much better than I did, and she makes it look good. Episode 15, we were introduced to my partner, Andy Graffio.
Mm-hmm.
He's a member of CMC Financial. He's a very integral part. And we talked about some year-end tax strategies, specifically around charitable giving and charitable deductions, and sort of what you need to make sure that you have if you give a cash donation, if you write a check, if it's certain dollar amounts. One thing we talked about was GoFundMe accounts, which a lot of people, do. They contribute to, and they bring it, and they say, well, I gave X number of dollars to so-and-so. Well, you can't really count that. And so we sort of talked through the philosophy on that. Then episode 16, we talked about investing into a new year. During our first year of the podcast, the stock market, we had a pretty good year. And so one of the things as an advisor, because again, I've been an advisor for 28 years, I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. And, sometimes when you have a really good year or a couple of really good years, it could be followed up with some volatility. And I talked about the example of Six Flags Over Georgia, which, I'm in Alabama. So a lot of times if we're driving, say, to Atlanta, you're going to drive down I-20 and you're going to pass Six Flags Over Georgia. Well, the first thing you see is this massive roller coaster called Goliath. And I talk about what that looks like relative to roller coasters, because I'm also a roller coaster fan.
Okay. And
so we talked about risk tolerance, diversifying your portfolio, rebalancing your portfolio, the importance of that. And so that's the logical side of investing. Episodes 17 and 18 was a part 1 and a part 2 on the behavioral side of investing and the psychology of investing. So we brought on Brendan Frazier,
Yep.
who is our chief behavioral officer at our firm. We talked really for 2 episodes about the emotional side of money, the psychology side of money. You also got to see a guest take over the podcast for the first time. So that was interesting. So Brendan has his own podcast.
Yes.
And so, he knows how to really do that. So I asked him a question, and I've always been told, don't ever ask someone a question you don't know the answer to. Well, he flipped it on me and asked me a question. And before I know it, he's kind of taken over the podcast. And so
He did.
So he did that in episode 18. So I'd encourage you to go back and listen to how that happened.
But that was a really good podcast. Both part 1 and part 2 were really good because yes, he did flip it on you.
Yeah.
He's very good at what he does. He's done, as you've mentioned before, a lot of podcasts on his own. And it was good to see you be put in the other position. Instead of asking the questions, you now have to answer the questions.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really effective thing to do for the podcast. And you were able to then talk about how you approach things and
Right.
your thought process as you're facing the same things that you're asking other people, your
Right.
clients.
Well, RJ, if I remember correctly, what it kind of boiled down to was experiences. Because we're talking about, we plan, we have this financial plan, which is a very logical, methodical, mathematical, financial plan. But if you don't know why you're going to do something,
Right.
it really doesn't matter how you do it. And so the reason that our firm even has a chief behavioral officer, which a lot of firms don't, to be quite candid, the reason we do is because he helps us as advisors and he helps clients, because he's done several events for us as well, for our clients and for our different prospects and things throughout the country, because our firm is CMC is in Birmingham, Alabama, but our registered investment advisor, RFG Advisory, is nationwide in many, many states. So Brendan works with all of the advisors. And so, but he's always talking about the emotional side of money, because money is very emotional. And so, that was a really cool 2 episodes, and we'll bring him back at some point to get even deeper into some of these concepts. But that was quarter 3,
Quarter 3, and you're talking about emotion, and we're going through it as a family. My wife's mom
Right.
is in a facility, and to be honest, I've learned a lot by watching what my wife is going through, and it's been difficult for her, and she really has no help. She has a sister, but her sister is, in the Midwest and really doesn't participate much. My wife basically runs the whole show, where I have my sister and my 2 brothers, and I'm kind of happy that we communicate pretty well. And in fact, coming up this weekend, the 4 of us are actually going to get together and start, talking about after my mom is gone,
Right.
things that we have to do. So these are things I've learned listening to you and watching my wife.
Right.
On how planning is so important. And I think if I was not involved in this, not listening to you, and not married to my wife, it could be a circus with my family. But because of experience, it's I feel much more confident in being able to put something together where we'll be able to know exactly, not exactly, because you never can plan because things pop up, but you have an idea what to do if something comes up.
Exactly. And RJ, I love that y'all as a family are going to have that discussion, because I see so many times where you don't have a family meeting, you don't have those family discussions. Something happens to, a parent, and you're like, okay, now what? And you're all just kind of looking around going, well, did mom ever tell you this? Or did mom ever tell you that? Or did dad ever say this? I mean, I never really heard him say that. And so the fact that y'all are having this discussion, I think is phenomenal. It's interesting that you brought that up right after we talked about Brendan, because one of the things that he has done is in sort of some of his coaching for clients going into this next year and the rest of the year is about family dynamics and family discussions and the emotional side. I think you mentioned both sisters and brothers. I will tell you, females and males also think differently when it comes to money. And it's not always that one gender is one way and one gender is another, but I will tell you, in more families than not, there's always sort of, one person that takes the lead and then the other person that's more of the emotional side. And I think it's really, really important when you're planning, when you're in my position, to sort of be that disinterested third party,
Right.
that can sort of help navigate through all of that. So I love the fact that y'all are meeting and as a family and having those discussions, because I will tell you, it's going to make things a lot easier when something does happen to mom.
Yeah, it's not an easy conversation. And you talk about emotional. My sister is the emotional one in our family, and the three boys. My dad, raised. He was from a different generation, and we're men. We're supposed to be men, and there are certain ways men are supposed to act, and he drilled that into our heads. So, my sister. When we were growing up, my father treated my sister much differently than he treated his three boys. And there was several reasons for that. I mean, one, that's what he believed. Women should be treated a certain way. And his sons drove him crazy. So he, obviously had to put the hammer down quite often.
Exactly. Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah, one of us was causing an issue.
Yeah, exactly. So RJ, we move into the fourth quarter of the podcast, if you will, and we brought on Rick Waddell, who is our Chief Investment Officer. We discussed everything from volatility to navigating risk in the various life stages. Going back to episode 3, I talked about the life stages, whether it's wealth accumulation, wealth preservation, or wealth distribution, and so navigating, the risk tolerance through each of those stages. Frankly, how to make financial planning a less daunting task, because I think sometimes advisors will sort of, try to make things too difficult. And so we try to, we're taking all these concepts, and we talk about a financial plan, but a financial plan could be 1 or 2 pages that has everything summarized, and then you have all the backup. But I think, are there ways to make it less daunting?
Sure.
Then episode 20 was, I'll kind of title it Story Time with Jim. I told 3 very specific, very distinct stories where we talked about combining insurance and estate planning, and the importance of each, the importance of having your documents in place, the importance of having beneficiaries and revisiting your beneficiaries, making sure that things are exactly as you want. We talked about estate planning, I think it was episode 6 just a little while ago, and that's probably one of the most procrastinated areas. And it still is. When we got to episode 20, it's still a procrastinated area. and the importance of having those documents in place. And I told stories around that, one of them actually being a personal story of how that sort of developed. Episode 21, we brought Victoria back. She is the only guest that made 2 appearances in the first year. And we discussed a totally separate topic this time. We talked about financial literacy, which is something that is near and dear to my heart. I feel like we do not do a great job in this country of teaching about financial topics. I have told stories in the past about, my first job out of college was with a bank.
Right.
And I get my first paycheck, and, I touched on the concept of gross pay and net pay. So, in my mind, my paycheck was going to be gross pay, but in reality, what the bank paid me was net pay. So I called my dad, now I'm a college graduate. I have graduated business school. And I called my dad, and I'm like, Dad, who the hell is FICA, and why are they taking my money?
Right.
And so when he, just like you laughed, when he got done laughing, he said, well, son, that's your Social Security. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, that's your retirement. And I said, Dad, I'm 22 years old. Why in the world do I need to be worried about retirement?
But that's a great point.
And so here, so here's me, a college graduate, and I mean, today I'm a financial planner. So one of the things I like to do is teach people about what is FICA, what is Social Security, what is Medicare, what is gross, what is net. We talked about that with Victoria, and she's done some pretty cool things at the University of Alabama, where she's the president of the Student Financial Planning Association, or FPA chapter, and sort of some things that she's doing there with a book club and really bringing that group and that organization up. And so we had her again. Episode 22 and 23 was a part 1 and 2. Totally different concept, but I'm going to go back to this whole cash flow. We talk about in investing and saving for goals. And one of the things that if you have daughters, like I do, you're always saving for this goal of a potential wedding. And so we had Amanda Callahan, who is a event planner, a wedding planner, an event planner, and that's sort of her experiences. And we talked about in episode 22 sort of some wedding things, wedding tips. I remember one of the first things she said when I said, okay, we've gotten engaged on Saturday night. Sunday, we've sort of let it hit us. And Monday morning, we awaken, and it's like, oh my gosh, we have a wedding to plan. Now what do you do? And I said, and so she said, well, if you reach out to a wedding planner, the first question she asks is, what's the budget? Okay. Well, here's where Dad comes in, because Dad's, saved for this thing, and he's like, hey, this is your budget. And it's like, okay, I don't really care how it's broken down, but this is it.
Right.
And so we discussed that, and then we talked about sort of the breaking it down. One of the most surprising things that came out from any guest on any podcast episode I've had was this concept of a social media planner as a part of your wedding.
Yes.
Because I was like, wait a minute, what? Because I'm familiar with photographer. I've seen weddings with videographers. But what Amanda did is she talked about in today's world, in the wedding planning world, how a lot of it's a social media event. And so you have a social media person as a part of, and this is a paid position, by the way, as a part of your wedding planning.
Right.
We touched on the rehearsal dinner, the engagement parties, things like that. So then we got to part 2 in the next episode, episode 23, and we talked about retirement parties, milestone birthdays, milestone anniversaries. I asked the question about gender reveals, because how do I know about gender reveals? Social media. And so is that a real thing? Yes, it is a real thing. And so we touched on all of those things from again, I'm going to go from an experience standpoint. So you're trying to create this experience, but it takes money to do that. And in order to have the money to do it, you're saving towards goals. Well, in order to save towards goals, you've got to know what's coming in and what's coming out. But as you're saving all these things, you've got these employee benefits, you've got these investments, you're trying to plan for your own retirement, tax law is changing, and you've always got the expectation of the what ifs, which is where insurance and estate comes in, because we want to make sure that our family gets what we want to leave them. So I think what I just did there is I summarized the entire podcast with those 6 puzzle pieces, and that was just year 1. Now, so what we've done in year 1 is we've laid a foundation. We've laid the foundation for the next several years on this podcast as we really start drilling down even deeper into each of these different areas. And, year 1 was fun. I've had a blast doing it. I think I've probably learned a little bit. I've probably, hopefully I'm asking questions a little better than I was way back in episode 1. And I've had a lot of fun. And so I wanted to summarize it, because we've got so many new people listening, and really just kind of go from there. And I'm excited about year 2.
Yes, lots of good information. Really, you do a real good job of getting interesting guests. And, the wedding planner was something when you told me at first, I was like, really? You're going to have a wedding planner on?
Yeah.
But it made sense. And then, of course, the social media aspect was just like, whoom, right
Yeah.
over my head. But,
Well, RJ too. That's been one of the not the but one of the top listened episodes.
not a surprise.
I have so many people. At our firm at CMC, we talk about working with generations.
Yeah.
And I
very
have
good.
a ton of clients where I'm working generationally, and so I may start with grandma and grandpa, and then they introduce me to mom and dad.
Right.
And then when I get introduced to mom and dad, the kids are in elementary school or middle school. Well, now all of a sudden they're graduating from college and they've got this employee benefits for the first time. So, I have on our website, on my calendar link, a thing called a 20-minute Ask Anything session. And I get a lot of requests from generational clients of, hey, Jim, can I ask you about this? And I always make that offering as well for that 20-minute Ask Anything session. And I really never know what the first question is going to be. And so when we talked about that wedding planner concept, I was like, that'd probably be a pretty cool episode. It should be interesting. It is amazing the number of that generation that has reached out or commented on posts and things like that about that whole concept. And so, yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, if you told me beforehand how popular it would be, I'd be like, but after listening to it, I was like,
Yeah.
I'm not surprised now
Yeah.
that it is very popular.
Yeah.
It makes sense. All right,
Yeah.
Jim, this was really fun to look back at
Yeah.
the year. You've had a great year, and I've enjoyed working with you. Before we wrap up, contact information.
Yeah. So contact information for me, my direct number is 205-510-9074. Our website is cmcfp.com. And we're on all of the social media links, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and then our YouTube channel as well. Podcast is on really anywhere you can get a podcast. You can get this. So.
Awesome. And if you can, check out the past podcasts. There's a lot of information there. And Jim, thank you so much. And thank you for listening to the Financial Puzzle Playbook podcast. We ask you to share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review because this actually helps others find the show. Again, thank you for listening. And for everyone at Financial Puzzle Playbook, I'm RJ Malik, and we'll see you at the next podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Financial Puzzle Playbook. Click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Don't forget to follow us on social media by checking the links in the description. And contact us today by visiting our website at www.cmcfp.com or give us a call at 205-510-9074. Content here is for illustrative purposes and general information only. It is not legal, tax, or individualized financial advice, nor is it a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any specific security, or engage in any specific trading strategy. Results will vary. Past performance is no indication of future results or success. Market conditions change continuously. This commentary reflects the personal opinions, viewpoints, and analyses of CMC Financial. It does not necessarily represent those of RFG Advisory, Private Client Services, their clients, or their employees. This commentary should not be regarded as a description of advisory services provided by CMC Financial or RFG Advisory, or performance returns of any client. The views reflected in the commentary are subject to change at any time without notice. Securities offered by registered representatives of Private Client Services, member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services offered by investment advisory representatives of RFG Advisory, a registered investment advisor. Private Client Services, CMC Financial, and RFG Advisory are unaffiliated entities. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where RFG Advisory and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. No advisory services may be rendered by RFG Advisory unless a client agreement is in place.